Hello and welcome. In this special edition of Classic Bus Histories, I will be looking into the history of the London Transport DMS class Fleetlines. It's a type that, in my opinion, has received a lot of unjust negative press over the years, and I think it's time to put the record straight. So join me on a return journey into the history of the London Transport DMS class Fleetlines. In the mid-60s, the technology of buses was changing. The Leyland Atlantean had been in production since 1958, and the Daimler Fleetline had been in production since 1960. Both these models were to a rear engine design, and while not necessarily committing themselves to large batches, many operators were dipping their toe in the water when it came to rear engine buses. It was new technology and they wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Among these operators was London Transport, who in 1965 ordered a trial fleet of 50 Leyland Atlanteans, but only 8 Daimler Fleetlines. The Leyland Atlanteans would all be painted red and were for the central area where they would go head to head with the much loved Routemaster, which at the time London Transport were receiving in large quantities. The Fleetlines were all painted in green and were for the country area operations. The Leyland Atlanteans didn't prove too successful, so some Daimler Fleetlines were brought in from the country area operations, and these were moderately more successful than their Leyland cousins. Also around this time, London Transport were dipping their toe in the water when it came to one-person operation, or one-man operation as it was known at the time. Some of the Daimler Fleetlines had been operated with one-man operation with the upper deck locked off, but this was deemed not to be a success. And London Transport were now looking at operating one-man operated single-decker buses, which would have given the buses a similar capacity to the RTs that they were to replace. But this was only possible with vast amounts of standing passengers. These buses would also feature automatic fare collection equipment in the shape of a turnstile, which you put the money into and then push through into the saloon. You could also still pay the driver in the conventional way though. But being crushed into a single-decker bus didn't prove very popular with the great travelling public. In September 1968, the former general manager of Manchester City Transport, Ralph Bennett, joined London Transport as the chief executive. He'd been heavily involved with the design of the Mancunian bus, which was built on Leyland Atlantean and Daimler Fleetline chassis, and took this design with him to London, where it presented a solution to the unpopular single-decker buses. This design was to become the DMS, Daimler Standee. Like the single-decker equivalent, the DMSs would feature automatic fare collection equipment, turnstiles at the front, but these would be more civilised as there would be more seats for everybody. They would be used to introduce one-man operation in the capital. The interiors would also be brighter than the current buses, with a new blue and green maquette designed by Misha Black, alongside a grey and white easy-to-clean interior. It was a world away from the sombre maroons, browns and creams of the RTs and the RMs, although the light colours on the moquette tended to show the dirt a little bit more than it did on the other buses. London Transport placed its first order for DMSs in 1968, but there were delays in production and delivery with the Daimler Fleetline, as at the time it was such a popular chassis. DMS1 wasn't delivered until late 1970, and both DMS1 and DMS2 were at the Commercial Motor Show at Earl's Court in September 1970. The DMSs started to enter service in January 1971, and they were initially allocated to Brixton, Shepherd's Bush, Highgate and Merton. As the DMS was introduced, there were slight changes to the design of the bodywork, with the headlights moved out to the extremities of the front panel. The DMS was being rolled out across London in some quantity now, and was used to replace not only RTs but also Routemasters and in some cases the much disliked AC Swifts. The DMS was either powered by the Gardner 6LXB engine or the Leyland 0680 engine. And there were two manufacturers of bodywork on the DMS. One was Park Royal and the other one was MCW. There are very small details to tell you whether you're looking at a Park Royal bus or an MCW bodied bus. And these are differences in the rear upper deck emergency exit, the rear lower deck emergency exit and the beading over the upstairs front windows. Interestingly, the Park Royal bodies were designed to be removed from the chassis so that it could be overhauled in the Routemaster style at Aldenham. MCW bodies should have been built this way, but they weren't. Later DMSs were delivered as the DM class, and this was basically a DMS that didn't have the automatic fare collection equipment and could be used as a crew bus, ironically. Later deliveries saw improved door systems with the two-piece jackknife doors fitted, and the last of the DMSs were fitted to the B20 Quiet Fleetline specification. These were fitted with a Leyland turbocharged engine, and the engine grills were moved up onto the rear of the bus to form chimneys. And this was in an attempt to try and bring the noise of the vehicle down, and was born out of the similar sort of thinking as the Bristol VRT3. But as to whether it was successful or not is another story, as these particular buses ended up with their own unique sound and certainly weren't as quiet as I think London Transport had hoped. Now it's fair to say that when London Transport ordered the DMS, they made modifications to it that made it anything but a standard Daimler Fleetline. These featured things like pesky interlock systems that stopped the bus from moving with the doors open and power steering. Also, in keeping with London Transport's specification, the cab display was rather Spartan. And whereon in the cab of contemporary buses you would find things like a temperature gauge and air gauges, on the DMS you didn't. London Transport had specified the flag style of warning system as again fitted to the Routemaster, and indeed later the Titan, and this was designed to drop a flag that said stop on it if the air pressure dropped below a certain level. As with many early rear-engine buses, there were teething problems and niggling problems. One of the problems that London Transport discovered was that brake wear on the DMSs was incredibly high. Now, the same staff shortages that had prompted one-man operation were also affecting the engineering departments on bus garages. And this meant that these little niggling problems and issues with the brakes weren't being sorted as well as they should be. Also, as well, at that time, British Leyland had taken over production of the Daimler Fleetline, and Leyland had very much a take it or leave it attitude, and the spare part supply wasn't as good as it could have been. So with preventive maintenance not being as good as it should be, and the lack of support from after-sales service, you could see that things weren't going to be going particularly well for the DMSs. Now, if you couple this to the fact that London Transport's maintenance regime was based around the RM and the RT, and these were taken to Aldenham, where the chassis and the bodywork and the running units were all separated, overhauled and then rejoined at the end of the works. Now, London Transport did try this with one of the early DMSs, DMS1. They tried to separate the bodywork from the chassis, but unfortunately the bodywork distorted so badly that it took them, I believe, 18 months to get it all put back together again. Even before the last one was delivered in 1978, London Transport had fallen out of love with the DMS and realised it wasn't the bus that they'd pinned their hopes to. Around the depots of London Transport had been stored various hulks of DMSs which were being used for spare parts. These were known as Christmas trees, and these were the first ones to go off for scrap. As the 7-year certificate of initial fitness started to expire, buses were being withdrawn in big numbers, with many heading straight to the scrapyard, which, when you consider the age of the bus and the mileage they covered, was pretty scandalous. And I wonder what the GLC taxpayer would have thought of it if they'd have known the whole story. But fortunately, Peter Newman of Enzyme Bus was on hand to realise that the DMS wasn't actually that bad a motor. And vast quantities of the DMS class bus passed through Enzyme's hands, where the majority had all the London quirks removed and went on to live second and sometimes third lives, with many different operators doing many different jobs. In fact, such was the Enzyme Bus influence when it came to the DMS that even now, when somebody asks the question on social media and says, does anybody have any bits for a DMS? Most people straight away will turn around and say, speak to Enzyme. And no, unfortunately, Enzyme don't have any DMS spares anymore. The list of buyers for the DMS was a very, very long one. There were national bus company subsidiaries, there were PTEs, there were municipal operators, and there were independent operators as well. On top of this, there were many that went for non-PSV use and were turned into hospitality units and exhibition units as well. These buses went on to see service for sometimes 10, 15, even 20 years after they'd left London Transport, which, to be fair, isn't too bad for a bus that was a bit of a throwaway vehicle, is it? Now, it can be argued that the DMS was in the right place at the right time when it was being withdrawn. The early 80s was a time of change in the bus industry in general, and Leyland had stopped production of the Fleetline and the Bristol VR, and the Atlantean's days were numbered. New technology in the form of the Leyland Olympian and the Leyland Titan were being pushed towards the operators. And as I've mentioned before, the bus industry can be very, very tetchy when it comes to things like progress. And with all the London specifications removed, the DMS became basically an older generation bus, which they were more comfortable at operating. There is a certain irony as well when it comes to the DMS, as many of the round London sightseeing tours were set up using DMS class Fleetlines. Companies like London Pride, City Rama and Culture Bus flourished in the 1980s, doing the round London sightseeing tours. And this went all the way through to when big bus companies started operating. And these became one of the last and well-known operators of DMSs in London. This is even more ironic when you consider that many newly delivered DMSs were first put on the official London sightseeing tour by London Transport in the 1970s. When it came to export, Enzyme managed to export the DMS to most countries in the world. One of the better known places though was to Hong Kong, where they ran in some vast quantity. And it's fair to say that the conditions in Hong Kong, with the humidity, the heat, the traffic and the loadings, are a lot more arduous than they are in London. And yet the DMS survived and operated incredibly well and built up quite a following out in Hong Kong as well. And indeed, at least one enthusiast travelled all the way over from Hong Kong to see DMS 550 at the South East Bus Festival one year, which I think is really amazing, and it just goes to show how much the enthusiasts out there respect and love the DMS class Fleetlines. Well, normally in this section we look at the life after the first operator, but we've already done that. But what happened when the DMSs came out of service for the second, maybe third, even sometimes fourth and fifth time? Sadly, very few of them have made it into preservation. And I think in part this was down to the enthusiasts' press at the time. A lot, but admittedly not all of the articles that you read in the magazines and in the fleet news as well were just emphasising on the withdrawals of the DMS class Fleetlines. And it's almost like they amplified the thoughts of London Transport by saying, yes, this is not a good bus and it needs to be got rid of as soon as possible. Plus, at the same time, enthusiasts were literally falling over themselves to try and buy RTs and Route Masters. And now we're left with this very strange situation where we have hundreds of RTs and Route Masters, but hardly any DMSs, with the majority of them going to scrap. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole argument about is the RM better than the DMS, but it is a shame that the DMS isn't represented more in preservation. As I've mentioned before, the DMSs that are preserved and go out and about regularly do attract an awful lot of attention, and they attract equally amount as nostalgia as the Route Masters do, as a whole generation were brought up riding around on DMSs and B20s and such. In addition to the preserved ones, there's still quite a few laying around in yards in various states of dereliction and waiting their term in the preservation queue. And I do think it's a shame that a lot of these buses do tend to get restored into the original London Transport livery, the livery of the one company that actually put the DMS down and tried telling us it was such a rubbish bus. It would be so nice to see a national bus company leaf green DMS, or one in the Wilts and Dorset livery. And imagine one in West Midlands Transport blue and cream, or Manchester Transport's orange and white. And then you had the Scottish ones with the best bus with us written on the side of them. So many liveries to choose from. I must admit my personal favourite though was either the Culture Bus yellow or the City Rama blue. What's your favourite livery that the DMS wore? I do hope that you've enjoyed this special edition of Classic Bus Histories. And it's gone some way into putting the record straight as far as the DMS is concerned. And if you're now looking at the DMS a little bit more favourably than you were at the beginning of the video, my work here is now done. If you did enjoy the video, please like and share it. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel, as not only does it help the channel grow, but you will receive notifications when I release further videos in this series. And talking of which, don't forget to check out my other videos here on sunny YouTube, as there's definitely something for everyone, and most of them are bus related, although there are a few trains, quite a few metro cab taxis, and I think at least one car ferry. Anyway, thanks for watching, bye for now.